What I'm going to speak about now is a short work written by Aime Cesaire. He's a poet and an essayist, cultural critic from Martinique. The book was first published in French in 1955 and translated into English a few years later. This is the work, Discourse on Colonialism. Now, this is a very short work, but it packs a punch. Some people will view it as exceedingly polemical. I think that works of this kind certainly have a polemical touch to them. In this case, it may well be far more than a polemical touch. But the question is whether it's a work that is only polemical or whether there is, in fact, actually an extraordinary substantive critique in this very short book. This is not to say that books that are polemical shouldn't be taken seriously, but that's a rather different matter. This book is very short. It's about 40 to 50 pages in length. The particular edition I have is one published by Monthly Review Press, and at the end of it is a very short interview with Cesaire as well. But in my brief remarks, I really want to focus on this work as well. Now, I think in the aftermath of the end of World War II, and as we move into the 1950s, the fundamental movement that we must think about in global terms is what can be called decolonization. This is a book really which can also be read as a plea for decolonization, but what it is fundamentally is, in fact, an extraordinary, withering critique of colonialism in something like 40 to 50 pages, as I've said. This is how Cesaire begins his book. A civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eye to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. What is it stricken by? A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. And before I proceed any further, I would like to pause and suggest that this is a book that is also written in the prophetic mode. In the prophetic mode. I don't think there are very many works that are actually written in the prophetic mode. But of course, we have to understand that this is not simply a work that is, quote, prophesizing the decline of Western civilization, and that too in the 1950s, when perhaps I think very few people would have even ventured to make an argument of that kind. Right? Because at the end of World War II, what one was witnessing was, in fact, actually, let's say 10 years after the end of the war, this book is published in 1955, was the rebirth of Europe, facilitated by the Marshall Plan, which the Americans had initiated, certainly the rebirth of Western Europe. Of course, there was a Cold War going on at that point in time, right? But I think that when I say that this is a work that is actually prophetic, what I mean by that is not simply that it is prophesizing something, but it's written in an idiom, which is the idiom of the great prophets almost, right? That it is a work that comes forth to us with staccato sort of effect, right? It's like, a machine gun firing of bullets insistently. So how does Cesaire continue what he has to say? The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeois rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise: the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. Now, when we read this, of course, we are tempted to immediately locate the work in a strand of what we might describe as Western Marxist anti-imperialism. Marxist anti-imperialism, right? Because he says that one of the major problems is the problem of the proletariat. And this is, of course, a term that we are familiar with from reading Marx and Marxist scholars and polemicists and intellectuals and, the century thereafter, right? And it also suggests to us when he says that the other fundamental problem is the colonial problem, that what Cesaire is referring to is, as I've suggested before, a strand of Marxist anti-imperialist thought, of which this book can be seen really as, perhaps I would say in some ways, not the foundational statement, but perhaps the most concise and incisive statement. Europe is indefensible, says Cesaire. So what is the nature of the argument of the book? Yeah. So he very briefly catalogs, if one wants to put it this way, the atrocities that were committed in the name of colonialism. Since Cesaire operates in the Francophone world, he is more sensitive to what we might describe as the atrocities committed by the French. But this book should not be read simply as an indictment of French colonialism. In fact, some of its arguments are very far-reaching. For example, one of the arguments that Cesaire puts forward in this work, an argument that I think really was not taken seriously at all in his own lifetime, and indeed even today, I suspect that most scholars, certainly of the Holocaust, would not take it seriously, and that is the view that Cesaire puts forward, namely that Nazism and colonialism, in fact, should not be seen as two separate phenomena, but rather that there is an intricate relationship between the two. One way to describe the relationship, of course, is that what Nazism did was it brought home colonialism into Europe itself. That is, that what was done to the Jews, what was done to the homosexuals, and what was done to the Slavic population. Because let us not forget that the Nazis didn't simply exterminate 6 million Jews and people who were viewed as mentally retarded, and the communists and homosexuals, all of whom were targeted, but the Nazis also had an extraordinary hatred for the Slavic population, a hatred that was actually shared by many people in Western Europe. I mean, if we go back to the 18th century, we certainly see that in the writings of people like Voltaire, a contemptuous dismissal of people who are Slavs. So what happened under Nazism was, in fact, that the kind of violence that was visited upon the colonies for centuries, and here I'm really looking not simply, therefore, at British and French colonialism or the Dutch in Indonesia, but I'm also going back to, obviously, the period of the conquistadors. I mean, it is not really necessary at this point to entertain thoughts and comments about the differences between the settler colonialism of one generation and the settler colonialism of, let's say, 3 centuries later, right? What for example, the English did in Australia, as opposed to the settler colonialism that one found, let's say, in the Americas, right? Those are the kinds of differences that obviously can be looked at in enormous detail, but this is not what Cesaire takes as his mandate. What he does take as his mandate is to demonstrate that colonialism, in fact, is a form of dehumanization. Dehumanization. And this is where, in fact, I think there's no question about it, Cesaire is really at his strongest. All right. So here I read a couple of passages from this book to move on as well to the next argument, which is related to this argument, that what in fact actually colonialism did was it transformed the people that it colonized. It represented them as objects, right? So he says, in fact, colonialism equals thingification. Thingification, that is, that in fact they were simply things. These were not people who were viewed as fully human. For my part, page 19 of this edition, if I have recalled a few details of these hideous butcheries, right? So he's described some atrocities. It is by no means because I take a morbid delight in them, but because I think that these heads of men, these collections of ears, he's referring, among many other things, to what Leopold did in the Congo, right? Where uh, the native people were set a target, you know, and said, well, you must, when you tap a rubber tree, this is how much you have to bring every day. And then what was tapped and what was brought forward to the colonizer was weighed, and if it turned out to be less than the quota that was assigned to them, they they were amputated. Their hands were amputated. Right? And we have tens of millions of people, really, in a way. I mean, the estimated toll is viewed as being about 10 million from the atrocities committed by Leopold. It may very well be more. But so when I say tens of millions, I'm referring not only to obviously what was done by Leopold in the Congo, but elsewhere too. Right? So, but because I think, to go back to that passage, that these heads of men, these collections of ears, these burned houses, these Gothic invasions, this steaming blood, these cities that evaporate at the edge of the sword are not to be so easily disposed of. They prove, these butcheries, these hideous butcheries, he's saying, they prove that colonization, I repeat, dehumanizes even the most civilized man. That colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. Right? And I think that this was one of the things that we saw in Ashish Nandi's work, which I discussed in an earlier talk, in The Intimate Enemy, that when we think of colonialism, we have to think about how not only colonialism ruined the lives of those it colonized, but the colonizers, in a manner of speaking, dehumanize themselves. And so, therefore, when we think about colonialism and we think about the liberation from colonialism, we have to think about not simply liberating the colonized, we have to think about liberating the colonizer from their own worst tendencies. Right? That the colonizer, who, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. It is this result, this boomerang effect of colonization, that I wanted to point out. And in the course of his analysis, Cesaire makes a number of arguments that are really vital. I'm just going to point to two of them. One is, he talks about the fact that the idea that is put forward in the writings of many colonizers, and it's really quite immaterial whether one is thinking of British colonization or the French or the Dutch or the Spanish or the Portuguese in an earlier period of time, for the most part. What is really common here is this notion that when they went to these places which they colonized, they simply viewed these territories as wasteland. Now, there are variations of that. So if you look at maps of Africa produced in the 19th century, one sees a map, for example, where the entire interior of Africa, so you take this massive continent and you leave aside the coastline, and the entire interior is simply described as unclaimed territory, which of course is absurd because of the people who are living there. And many of these people were pastoralists, not all of them, but many of them were pastoralists. And when the Europeans claimed that this is all unclaimed, what they mean by that in part is that, hey, the natives don't really know what to do with our land. They don't make productive use of it. It's simply wasteland. If it falls into our hands, we will make the desert bloom. Right? An argument that was advanced even by Martin Buber in his response to what Gandhi had written in his famous piece called The Jews on 2nd November 1938. And one of the things that Buber objected to in Gandhi's analysis of what was happening in Palestine and his eventual defense of the right of the Palestinians or the Arabs to their land there. One of the arguments, even Martin Buber, who was really the most enlightened Jewish theologian of his day, a Zionist who was nonetheless opposed to the creation of the state of Israel, even this Martin Buber says in his rejoinder to Gandhi that it is really the Jewish settlers who came into Palestine in the 1920s and the 1930s who finally made the desert bloom, because the Arabs were doing nothing. Right? So this is one argument that Cesaire is very sensitive to, and he's entirely correct in suggesting the centrality of this argument to the enterprise of colonialism. But he also says a second thing, and I think that this is worth mentioning because sometimes it is mentioned by many in passing, including those who are actually critical of colonialism, but nonetheless say that, look, one of its consequences was that it brought different people and different parts of the world, so to speak, into contact with each other. Now, I think that that's an absurdity, right? I mean, this is not the optimal condition under which contact between cultures should take place. And of course, if one takes that very seriously, the argument that I'm putting forward here, then one would also have to think about modern forms of contact, such as mass tourism, which I think are also detrimental in various ways. But that's a question that I'm going to take up when I discuss some other works. Right? The manner in which now tourism is justified, mass tourism, and therefore, of course, a mass increase in consumption and a mass increase in carbon emissions and the carbon footprint that we leave behind, that many times this is simply justified by saying that, well, what tourism really does is it opens up a person's mind to the fact that there is a wide world out there. Well, what are the circumstances under which we encounter another culture? Before we colonize them, now we consume these cultures. Now, Cesaire is not writing about this aspect of it, but this is, of course, one of the things that we have to do is that when we read works of this kind, we have to extrapolate, we have to imagine how we can keep alive this work in extending some of the arguments that are given. So this is what he says about the contact. Quote, between colonizer and colonized, there is room only for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, introducing cash crops, changing the nature of what used to be subsistence farming. Contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinnishness, brainless elites, degraded masses. No human contact, but relations of domination and submission which turn the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. My turn to state an equation. Colonization equals thingification. I hear the storm. They talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. End quote. What Cesaire is doing is he's saying that, when I make an argument, I can anticipate what the rejoinder is going to be. By all those who are going to say, look what the colonizers brought to Africa. They cured diseases. They improved the standards of living. They brought progress. They brought development. They brought the railways. And what Cesaire does is he just blows all of this into smithereens with fantastic effect. The book is brilliantly written. One may have certain disagreements. I do, and those disagreements stem, but that is not central to the book. And namely, that those disagreements stem from the fact that Cesaire was very much a Marxist of his generation. And that meant that he was quite oblivious to what was really happening under the name of Marxism as well, what communist states were doing. But none of that in any way exculpates the colonizer. None of that in any way should be allowed to obfuscate what Cesaire is able to achieve in this brilliant work where he attempts to understand in a very incisive fashion the extraordinarily detrimental consequences of colonization for the entire world. And so I end with that.